Walter Grayson owned more than 600 acres of farmland, 3 grain elevators, and enough investments to make sure his family would never struggle financially for generations. People throughout the county respected him. They knew his handshake. They knew his word was worth more than most contracts. They knew the Grayson name carried weight. But after his wife Martha died, Walter discovered something that frightened him more than losing money ever could. His children only seemed to call when they needed something. A loan, advice, a signature, a favor. No one asked how he slept in the empty farmhouse. No one asked how he handled eating dinner alone at a table built for 6. No one asked how he survived the silence that Martha's absence left behind. At first, Walter told himself he was imagining it. Grief had a way of making everything feel worse. But month after month, the pattern repeated itself. Then one evening, while sorting through Martha's belongings, Walter found a journal she had written years before. One sentence stopped him cold. A father should never have to wonder whether his children love him more than what he can give them. Walter sat alone in their bedroom for a long time after reading those words. The next morning, he called his attorney. Within weeks, every dollar, every acre, every investment was hidden safely inside a trust nobody knew existed. Then Walter did something no one expected. He left the beautiful farmhouse he and Martha had spent nearly 50 years building together. He moved into a rundown trailer at the far edge of his own property. And he told his 4 children the same devastating lie. The farm was bankrupt. The money was gone. Everything had been lost. For 9 months, Walter watched. One child came looking for answers. One came hoping for money. One barely came at all. And one showed up every single week without asking for anything. What Walter learned during those 9 months would change his family forever. But before he could discover which child truly loved him, he would first have to confront a painful truth about himself. Because sometimes the hardest test isn't the one we give other people. It's the one life gives us. Long before Grayson Ridge Farm became one of the most successful agricultural operations in the county, it had been 80 acres of struggling land and a young couple with more determination than money. Walter Grayson was 24 years old when his father died. The inheritance wasn't much. A weather-beaten farmhouse, a few pieces of aging equipment, and debt. A lot of debt. Most people assumed the farm would be sold within a year. Walter almost believed it himself. Then he met Martha. She wasn't impressed by acreage or machinery. She wasn't interested in status. She fell in love with the quiet young farmer who worked until dark and still worried about paying his employees before paying himself. They married 6 months later in a small church outside town. The reception was held in Martha's parents' backyard, beneath strings of borrowed lights. Their wedding cake leaned slightly to one side because Martha's aunt had baked it herself. Neither of them cared. They were too busy dreaming about the future. The first years were hard. The farmhouse roof leaked whenever it rained. The furnace broke every winter. The tractor seemed to need repairs every planting season. Walter worked the fields. Martha managed everything else. Together they survived. Then they began to thrive. One good harvest became 3. 3 became 10. They purchased neighboring acreage whenever it became available. Years passed. The farm expanded. The first grain elevator was built, then a second, then a third. By the time Walter turned 50, Grayson Ridge Farm had become one of the largest operations in the region. But the achievement Walter valued most wasn't measured in acres. It was his family. Trevor was born first. Ambitious and confident, he always dreamed of life beyond the county line. Vanessa followed 2 years later. Sharp-minded and fiercely independent, she challenged every teacher she ever had. Brandon arrived third. Quiet and practical, he preferred engines and tools to conversation. Then came Abigail, a surprise baby born when Martha thought their family was already complete. She quickly became the light of the household. The years moved forward. Children grew. Careers began. Grandchildren arrived. Life changed. Yet through every season, Martha remained the center of everything. She remembered birthdays. She organized holidays. She kept everyone connected. Walter provided. Martha united. It was a balance that worked perfectly until one Tuesday afternoon. The doctor entered the examination room carrying test results.
Martha reached for Walter's hand before the doctor even spoke.
Something in her eyes told him she already knew. And moments later, their entire world began to collapse. "Mrs. Grayson," the doctor said softly, "I'm afraid the results aren't good. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor explained treatment options, timelines, probabilities, and medical terms neither Walter nor Martha would remember later. What Walter remembered was the way Martha squeezed his hand. Not hard, not desperately, just enough to tell him she was still thinking about him, even as her own world collapsed. On the drive home, neither of them spoke much. The field stretched endlessly beyond the truck windows. Corn swayed beneath a summer breeze. The world looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed. Martha fought the disease for 9 months. She endured chemotherapy, radiation, hospital visits, days when getting out of bed required more strength than she thought she possessed. Through it all, she remained herself. She still remembered birthdays, still called the grandchildren, still asked Walter if he was eating enough whenever she caught him skipping lunch. The children came during those months, but not equally. Trevor flew in twice from Missouri. Each visit lasted less than 48 hours. He spent most of the time juggling phone calls and business meetings. Vanessa came once during Christmas break. She brought gifts, flowers, and good intentions, but her laptop remained open for much of the visit. Work always seemed to follow her. Brandon stopped by occasionally on his way home from jobs. His small repair business was struggling. His visits often felt rushed, like a man carrying invisible weights he couldn't put down. Only Abigail came every weekend, without fail. Every Saturday morning, her station wagon appeared in the driveway. Lucas drove whenever he could. Chloe and Ethan filled the house with laughter. Abigail sat beside her mother for hours. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply held hands. Sometimes Abigail read aloud from Martha's favorite novels, while Walter listened from the doorway. The sound of their voices made the house feel alive. Martha passed away on a Thursday morning in July. Walter was holding her hand when it happened. One moment she was there, the next moment she wasn't. The silence that followed felt impossible, as if the entire farm had stopped breathing. The funeral drew nearly 200 people, neighbors, farmers, business owners, church friends, people whose lives Martha had quietly touched for decades. Walter barely remembered the service. He sat in the front pew beside his children while condolences washed over him like distant noise. Afterward, during the reception, he began noticing things, small things. Things that seemed insignificant at first. Trevor spent nearly 20 minutes talking to a commercial land investor near the parking lot. Walter overheard phrases like acreage valuation and development potential. Vanessa checked her phone constantly, even while people shared stories about Martha. Brandon approached Walter near the hallway. He shuffled awkwardly before asking whether Martha's insurance paperwork had been filed. Walter knew Brandon wasn't being cruel. He was worried, but the timing still stung. Then Abigail found him standing alone near the kitchen sink. He wasn't washing dishes, wasn't drinking water. He was simply standing there staring at nothing. Without saying a word, she stepped beside him. She turned off the running faucet. Then she took his hand and stayed. For several minutes they stood together while conversations echoed throughout the church. No speeches. No advice, no explanations, just presence. Walter would remember that moment long after he forgot most of the funeral. The months afterward were worse. The farmhouse became unbearably quiet. Martha's chair remained empty. Her gardening gloves still hung near the back door. Her favorite coffee mug sat untouched in the cabinet. Trevor called in September, not to ask how Walter was coping, to discuss selling one of the grain elevators. Vanessa missed Thanksgiving because of work. Brandon requested financial help to keep his business operating. And Abigail continued calling every Sunday evening. Every single one. One rainy April afternoon, while organizing Martha's closet for donation, Walter reached for a storage box on the top shelf. Something slipped. A leather-bound journal fell into his hands. Walter stared at it. Martha's handwriting covered the first page. He sat down on the edge of the bed, opened the journal, and began to read. What he discovered inside would change everything. Walter sat on the edge of the bed long after sunset. The journal rested in his hands. Outside, the spring wind moved softly through the fields surrounding Grayson Ridge Farm. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. He opened the journal again. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Martha wrote about weather patterns, planting schedules, family gatherings, recipes she wanted to remember, funny things the grandchildren had said, small moments that might have otherwise disappeared. Then Walter found an entry dated 4 years before her diagnosis. He read it once, then twice, then a third time. Walter loves the children deeply, but he speaks love in the language of responsibility. He provides, he fixes problems, he writes checks. But sometimes I wonder if they know how proud he is of them. Walter swallowed hard. The next entry hit even harder. The children come to their father when they need something because that's how they've learned to approach him. It's the language he taught them. Transactions, solutions, practical things. I wish they knew how much more he feels than he ever says. Walter closed the journal. The words unsettled him because they felt true. Over the years, he had always believed actions mattered more than words. He worked long hours, paid college tuition, helped with down payments, provided financial support whenever one of the children struggled. To Walter, that was love. But Martha seemed to be saying something different. She was saying he had spent decades building a farm while unintentionally allowing emotional distance to grow inside his own family. For several days, Walter carried the journal with him everywhere. He read entries during breakfast, read them in the evenings, read them while sitting on the porch, where he and Martha used to watch sunsets together. Each page felt like a conversation he should have had years earlier. One Friday morning, Walter drove into town. Nathaniel Brooks looked surprised when Walter appeared at his office without an appointment. The attorney had handled the Grayson family's legal affairs for more than 20 years. He knew Walter well enough to recognize when something serious was happening. Nathaniel closed the office door. "What can I do for you?" Walter placed Martha's journal on the desk. Then he explained everything. The funeral, the phone calls, the growing feeling that his children were connected to his money more than to him. Nathaniel listened carefully. When Walter finished, silence filled the room. Finally, the attorney leaned back. "I assume you didn't drive all the way here just to tell me this?" Walter shook his head. "No." "What do you want to do?" Walter stared out the office window. Across the street, people moved in and out of stores without realizing the decision being made inside the room. "I want to know who would still come if I had nothing." Nathaniel frowned. "Walter, that's dangerous." "Maybe. You could damage relationships that are already fragile." Walter nodded slowly. "They're fragile already." Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked the question that mattered. "Have you thought this through?" For the first time in months, Walter felt completely certain about something. Every day, the plan took shape over the following weeks. All farm revenue would quietly flow into a protected trust. The grain elevators would continue operating normally. The investment accounts would remain untouched. Everything would be legally protected. Everything would appear gone. Nathaniel handled the paperwork. Meanwhile, Walter visited Gerald Whitaker. His oldest friend listened without interrupting. When Walter finally finished explaining, Gerald removed his hat and scratched his gray beard. "Martha would probably call this the dumbest idea you've ever had." Walter laughed despite himself. "Probably. And you're doing it anyway? I need answers." Gerald sighed heavily. Then he nodded. "All right, I'll help." By late August, the preparations were complete. Walter packed a few boxes. Martha's photograph, the journal, a handful of clothes. Nothing more. The farmhouse stood silent behind him as he carried the last box outside. Tomorrow he would move into the old trailer, near the northern edge of the property. Tomorrow, he would begin the lie, and tomorrow he would discover whether Martha's final lesson was right all along. Walter moved into the trailer on the first day of September. It sat on the far northern edge of Grayson Ridge Farm, hidden behind a line of cottonwood trees that bordered a narrow creek. The trailer had once housed seasonal workers decades earlier. Time had not been kind to it. The aluminum siding was faded, the flooring curled upward in several places, the kitchen cabinets hung slightly crooked. When the wind blew hard enough, the entire structure seemed to groan in protest. Walter stood inside and looked around. For nearly 50 years he had lived in the farmhouse he and Martha had built together. Now he was standing in a 12-foot wide trailer, with peeling wallpaper and a furnace that rattled like loose machinery. The contrast was almost laughable. Almost. He unpacked only the essentials. Martha's photograph sat on the small kitchen counter. Her journal rested beside it. A coffee maker occupied the corner. The rest of the trailer remained mostly empty. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the fields, Walter sat at the fold-down table and picked up his phone. It was time. The first call was to Trevor. His eldest son answered on the third ring. "Dad?" Walter took a breath and delivered the story he had rehearsed dozens of times. Bad investments, crop losses, debt, foreclosure. The farm was finished. The money was gone. When he finished speaking, silence filled the line. Finally, Trevor spoke. "How did this happen?" Walter gave the explanation. Trevor listened. Then came the question. Is there anything left? Any equity? Any assets that can be protected? Walter stared at Martha's photograph. No. Another pause. "I need time to think about this." The call ended 6 minutes later. The second call went to Vanessa. She answered immediately. Walter repeated the same story. By the time he finished, her voice sounded genuinely shocked. "Oh my God, Dad." For a moment, Walter felt hopeful. Then Vanessa asked, "What's your plan now?" "I don't know." "Well, you'll need one. Maybe there are programs available. Maybe assisted housing. We'll figure something out." The concern sounded sincere, but it felt distant, like someone discussing a problem rather than a person. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Next came Brandon. Walter barely finished speaking before Brandon interrupted. "What about the money?" "What money?" "The loan. The money you promised to help me with if things got bad." Walter closed his eyes. "It's gone, Brandon." The silence that followed felt different from the others. Not cold, not calculating, desperate. Brandon's business had been struggling for months. Walter knew that. The inheritance had probably become part of his survival plan. "I see," Brandon said quietly. Then the line disconnected. Walter stared at the phone for several seconds before making the final call. Abigail answered on the second ring. "Hi, Dad." Her voice immediately reminded him of Martha, not because it sounded the same, because it carried the same warmth. Walter told the story one last time. Bankruptcy, debt, the trailer, the loss of everything. He waited. Abigail remained silent until he finished. Then she asked a question none of the others had asked. "Are you safe?" Walter blinked. "What? Are you safe?" "I'm fine." "Are you eating?" "Yes." "Do you have heat?" The questions came one after another. Simple, practical, personal. Questions about him. Not the money, not the property, not the future value of the land. Him. Finally she exhaled. "I'm coming Saturday." "You don't need to do that." "Yes, I do." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." For a moment, Walter heard Martha again. The same gentle stubbornness, the same refusal to accept obvious nonsense. "I'll be there around 9, Abigail said. "Abigail, that's not a discussion, Dad." Then she hung up. The trailer suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness. Walter opened a small notebook he had purchased earlier that week. On the first page, he wrote 4 names: Trevor, Vanessa, Brandon, Abigail. Beneath each name, he recorded their first reactions. When he finished, he stared at the page for a long time. 3 children had responded to the loss. Only one had responded to the person experiencing it. Walter closed the notebook. For the first time since beginning the test, he wasn't sure whether he wanted to discover the truth. Because deep down, He already suspected what the truth might be. And Saturday was only 3 days away. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze moving across the fields. Walter heard Abigail's station wagon before he saw it. The familiar sound of gravel crunching beneath tires echoed outside the trailer. A moment later, the vehicle came into view. Chloe was waving excitedly through the back window. Ethan sat beside her holding a toy tractor. Walter felt something unexpected. Relief. The trailer door opened before he could step outside. "Dad!" Abigail crossed the short distance and wrapped her arms around him. The hug lasted longer than any conversation they had shared in months. When she finally stepped back, she studied his face carefully. "You look tired." "I'm fine." "You live in a trailer." Walter couldn't help smiling. "That's true." Without another word, Abigail opened the rear hatch and began unloading grocery bags. Milk, bread, eggs, coffee, soup, fresh fruit. Enough food to fill every empty cabinet in the trailer. Walter watched silently. "You didn't have to buy all this." "I know." "Then why did you?" Abigail shrugged. "Because you need groceries." The simplicity of the answer made him laugh. Inside, Chloe and Ethan immediately began exploring. To them, the trailer wasn't sad. It was an adventure. Ethan proudly announced that Grandpa's house looked like a giant camping trailer. Chloe declared the tiny kitchen adorable. Walter suspected neither description was entirely accurate. For the next several hours, Abigail moved through the trailer noticing things. The dripping faucet, the loose cabinet hinge, the broken step outside. She fixed what she could without mentioning it, not because she wanted praise, because she saw a problem and wanted it solved. Exactly the way Martha used to. That evening, after Abigail and the children left, Walter opened his notebook. Under Abigail's name, he wrote, "Brought groceries, fixed faucet, repaired cabinet, never asked about money, asked if I was lonely." He stared at the words. Then he underlined the last sentence twice. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Every Saturday, Abigail came. Sometimes Lucas joined her. Sometimes he stayed home with work obligations. But Abigail always came. Rain, wind, busy schedules. It didn't matter. She showed up. Meanwhile, the others appeared in different ways. Trevor visited once. His expensive sedan looked strangely out of place beside the aging trailer. He spent nearly 2 hours discussing financial strategies, market conditions, property values, debt restructuring, future options. Not once did he ask whether Walter liked living there. When Trevor left, Walter recorded every detail in the notebook. Vanessa called twice during September. Both conversations were polite, brief, professional. She always sounded concerned, yet somehow distant, like a person checking on a situation rather than a father. Brandon was different. His struggle was becoming harder to ignore. One afternoon, he arrived unexpectedly. His truck looked older than Walter remembered. So did Brandon. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. The confident mechanic who once dreamed of expanding his business seemed exhausted. They sat at the small trailer table drinking coffee. For nearly 20 minutes, Brandon talked about nothing important: weather, traffic, equipment repairs. Finally, he stopped. His hands tightened around the coffee mug. "The business isn't doing well." Walter remained quiet. Brandon stared at the tabletop. "I've been trying to keep everything together." The words came slowly, as if admitting them hurt. "Some months, I can barely make payroll." Walter listened. Part of him wanted to reach across the table, to tell Brandon everything, to explain that the money still existed, that the farm was safe. That help was available, but he remained silent. The test continued. Brandon swallowed hard. Then he said something that stayed with Walter long after the visit ended. "I honestly thought the inheritance would save me." The confession hung between them, painfully honest, painfully human. When Brandon finally left, Walter opened the notebook again. He wrote for several minutes. Then he added one final line beneath Brandon's entry. Not greed, fear. That night, Walter sat outside beneath a sky filled with stars. The notebook rested on his lap. Abigail's section was already longer than everyone else's combined. And for the first time since beginning the experiment, Walter felt something dangerous growing inside him. Guilt. Because while he was learning the truth about his children, life wasn't standing still. Brandon was sinking. Vanessa was drifting further away. Trevor remained focused on business, and Abigail kept giving without asking for anything in return. The question was no longer whether the test was working. The question was whether Walter could live with what it was revealing, especially if things became worse. And winter was coming. Winter arrived early that year. By late November, frost coated the fields each morning. The corn had long been harvested. The trees stood bare against gray skies, and the old trailer groaned under every cold wind that swept across the northern edge of Grayson Ridge Farm. Walter woke one morning to find delicate patterns of ice covering the inside corners of the windows. He stared at them while pulling on a second flannel shirt. The furnace rattled loudly before finally coughing warm air into the trailer. Even then, the cold never completely disappeared. It lingered in the walls, in the floor, in his aging joints. Walter had spent decades living comfortably in a warm farmhouse. Now he understood how difficult this life truly was. Yet every Saturday morning, Abigail still came. The weather never seemed to matter. One week she arrived through freezing rain, the next through 6 inches of fresh snow. Another time she drove through winds strong enough to push her station wagon across the road. She never complained, never asked for recognition. She simply arrived. The trailer slowly began changing because of her. Blue curtains appeared over the windows. A crocheted blanket covered the couch. A small lamp replaced the harsh overhead light. Family photographs appeared on shelves. The trailer no longer felt abandoned. It felt lived in. One Saturday, Abigail arrived carrying a large casserole dish. The smell filled the trailer almost immediately. Walter recognized the recipe, chicken and rice, one of Martha's favorites. Abigail placed the dish on the table and smiled. Mom taught me when I was 16. Walter looked at the food, then at his daughter, then away again before she could see the emotion in his eyes. That evening, after Chloe and Ethan had fallen asleep beneath blankets in the back of the trailer, Abigail sat across from her father, drinking coffee. The small lamp cast a warm glow over the room. "You don't have to explain what happened," she said quietly. Walter looked up. "What do you mean?" "The farm, the money, the bankruptcy." Abigail shrugged. "It doesn't change anything." Walter studied her face. "Not even a little?" "No." "You never wonder about the details?" She smiled. "Sometimes." "Then why don't you ask?" The answer came immediately. "Because you're more important than the answers." Walter looked down at his coffee cup. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Eventually, he changed the subject. But the words stayed with him. "Because you're more important than the answers." After Abigail left that night, Walter opened his notebook. The pages under her name were multiplying rapidly. Groceries, repairs, meals, visits, phone calls, kindness. Every week seemed to add another page. Meanwhile, Trevor's section remained short. Vanessa's even shorter. Brandon's entries had become increasingly painful. 2 weeks before Christmas, Gerald Whitaker stopped by. Snow clung to his boots as he entered the trailer, carrying a thermos of coffee. The 2 old friends sat at the table, watching flakes drift past the window. Finally, Gerald spoke. "How much longer?" Walter knew exactly what he meant. "I don't know." "You've been here 4 months." Walter nodded. "You have your answer." "Maybe." Gerald shook his head. "No maybe about it." The rancher pointed toward the notebook lying on the counter. "One daughter drives out here every week." Walter remained silent. "One son is drowning financially. Another barely calls. The third is married to her career." Gerald leaned forward. "What exactly are you waiting for?" Walter stared into his coffee. The truth was complicated. At first he had wanted answers. Now he had them. Yet something kept him going. Something harder to admit. "I need to know if it lasts." Gerald frowned. "If what lasts?" "The love." The older man sighed heavily. Then he delivered a question Walter wasn't prepared for. "Are you still testing them?" Walter looked up. "Or are you punishing them?" The words landed like a punch. The trailer suddenly felt smaller, quieter. For several moments, neither man spoke. Because deep down, Walter feared Gerald might be right. The test had started as a search for truth. But now guilt was becoming part of it, especially when he thought about Brandon, the struggling business, the fear in his eyes. the hope he had placed in an inheritance that didn't exist. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. Wind rattled the trailer walls. Snow tapped softly against the windows, and for the first time since beginning the experiment, he wondered whether he had already gone too far. Outside, winter tightened its grip on the farm. Inside, something far more dangerous was beginning to grow. A cough. At first, it seemed harmless. By January, it wouldn't be. The cough started as a minor irritation, a scratch in Walter's throat. A little congestion. Nothing worth worrying about. At least that's what he told himself. For nearly a week, he ignored it. He continued chopping firewood, continued making coffee every morning, continued pretending the cold didn't bother him. But the cough grew worse. By the second week of January, it had settled deep inside his chest. Simple tasks left him exhausted. Walking from one end of the trailer to the other felt strangely difficult. At night, sleep came in short stretches between coughing fits. Still, Walter refused to call anyone, especially Abigail. She was already doing too much. Every Saturday she drove out to the trailer. Every Sunday she called. Every week she worried. The last thing he wanted was to become another burden. Then Sunday evening arrived. As always, the phone rang at 6 o'clock. Abigail, Walter answered. Hi, Dad. Hello. The moment he spoke, silence followed. A different kind of silence. The kind that appears when someone hears something alarming. What's wrong? Abigail asked. Nothing. You're sick. It's just a cold. Walter immediately regretted saying it. Abigail knew him too well. You sound terrible. I'm fine. No, you're not. The firmness in her voice reminded him so much of Martha that he almost smiled. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Abigail, 8 o'clock. Then she hung up. The next morning, she arrived exactly at 8. One look at Walter was enough. She didn't argue, didn't ask permission, didn't negotiate. She simply grabbed her coat and said, We're going to the clinic. 3 hours later, a doctor confirmed what Abigail already suspected. Pneumonia. The word hit harder than Walter expected. At 72 years old, pneumonia wasn't something to ignore. The doctor recommended hospitalization. Walter refused immediately. Abigail argued. The doctor argued. Even the nurse joined the discussion. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Walter could recover in the trailer under one condition. Someone had to stay with him. Abigail volunteered before anyone could ask. That afternoon, she called Lucas. I'm staying here for a few days. No problem, Lucas replied. I'll handle everything at home. She called her school, arranged for a substitute teacher, canceled plans, rescheduled responsibilities, never once complained. For 4 days, Abigail practically lived in the trailer. She monitored medications, cooked soup, checked his temperature, made sure he drank enough water. At night, she slept on the couch a few feet away. Whenever Walter woke coughing, she was there, sometimes with medicine, sometimes with tea, sometimes simply sitting nearby until the coughing passed. On the second day, Lucas arrived carrying sheets of insulation. Without being asked, he crawled beneath the trailer and spent hours sealing gaps where freezing air entered. By evening, the trailer felt noticeably warmer. Walter watched from the window. Lucas never mentioned the effort, never asked for thanks. He simply worked exactly the way Walter himself had worked most of his life. The realization struck unexpectedly. Abigail hadn't married a man who talked about family values. She had married one who lived them. On the third evening, Walter's fever finally began breaking. He sat upright in bed for the first time all week. Abigail was grading school papers beneath the small lamp she had brought from home. The sight made something tighten in his chest. Not from illness, from gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. Abigail looked up. For what? For staying. She smiled. You're my father. The answer sounded so simple, yet it carried more meaning than anything else she could have said. Later that night, after Abigail had fallen asleep, Walter couldn't rest. Instead, he reached for Martha's journal. The pages had become familiar companions during lonely evenings. He opened to a random entry. Within seconds, he stopped reading, then started over. Walter loves the children deeply, but he assumes they already know it. Walter stared at the words. Another paragraph followed. Trevor wanted his father's approval more than money. Vanessa wanted attention more than advice. Brandon wanted encouragement more than rescue. Abigail simply wanted time. Walter closed his eyes. The truth hit him harder than the pneumonia. For months he had been testing his children, measuring their actions, recording their failures. But Martha's journal revealed something else. A second test. One he had been failing for decades. Trevor spoke in business language because Walter had taught him that language. Vanessa buried herself in work because she had learned achievement mattered. Brandon asked for financial help because money was often how Walter expressed love. The distance between them wasn't entirely their fault. Part of it belonged to him. For the first time since moving into the trailer, Walter stopped thinking about what he had learned about his children. Instead, he began thinking about what he had learned about himself. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the blue curtains Abigail had sewn, Walter made a decision. The test had to end. He could no longer sit in this trailer collecting evidence. There were truths that needed to be spoken, apologies that needed to be made, and a family that needed one final chance to become whole again. The moment he recovered, he would bring everyone together and tell them everything. Spring arrived slowly. The snow melted. The field softened. Life returned to Grayson Ridge Farm. But inside the trailer, Walter carried a decision he could no longer postpone. The test was over. The answers had been collected. The notebook was full. Now came the hardest part, telling the truth. One Saturday evening in late May, Walter sat beside Abigail on the trailer steps. The sun was sinking behind the fields. Chloe and Ethan chased fireflies near the creek. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Walter finally broke the silence. "I need you to do something for me."
Abigail turned toward him. "What is it?"
"I need everyone here."
She studied his face.
"Everyone?" "Trevor, Vanessa, Brandon." Abigail nodded slowly. "Why?" Walter looked out across the fields. "Because it's time." Something in his voice told her not to ask further questions. "I'll make the calls." The following week, she did exactly that. Trevor immediately assumed the meeting involved property. Vanessa complained about her schedule.
Brandon sounded exhausted.
Yet all three agreed to come. Saturday morning arrived warm and clear. Walter woke before sunrise. For the first time in 9 months, he drove back to the farmhouse. Gerald had spent the previous week preparing it. The windows were clean. The floors swept. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Everything looked almost exactly as Martha had left it. Walter stood in the doorway for several minutes. Memories surrounded him. Birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, family arguments, family laughter, the life they had built together. By 10 o'clock, everyone had arrived. Abigail came first. Then Vanessa. Trevor arrived shortly after. Brandon came last. He looked thinner than Walter remembered, more tired, more defeated. The 5 of them gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where all 4 children had grown up, the same table where Martha had served thousands of meals, the same table where she had held the family together. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter stood. The farm never went bankrupt. The room froze. Trevor blinked. Vanessa stared. Brandon looked genuinely confused. Only Abigail remained still. Walter continued. "The grain elevators are operating. The land was never sold. The money never disappeared." Silence. Absolute silence. Then Trevor stood abruptly. "What?" "I lied." The words landed heavily. Walter felt every eye fixed on him. "I lied about all of it." Brandon's face turned pale. Vanessa slowly sat back in her chair. Trevor's jaw tightened. "You lied for 9 months?" Walter nodded. "I needed to know something." "What?" The question came from Trevor. His voice was sharp, controlled, dangerously controlled. Walter picked up the worn notebook from the table. The notebook that had become his companion through every lonely day. "I needed to know who would still come if I had nothing left." Trevor stared at him. "You're serious?" Walter opened the notebook. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from regret. He began reading. Trevor's visits. The questions about assets. The calls about property values. The conversations about land. Every entry. every observation. Trevor's expression hardened with each sentence. Then Walter turned to Vanessa. The phone calls, the missed visits, the endless postponements, the excuses, the distance. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Next came Brandon. The conversations about money, the desperation, the fear, the failing business, the hope placed in an inheritance that never existed. Brandon's shoulders sagged lower with every word. Finally, Walter closed the notebook. He didn't need it anymore. Not for Abigail. Everyone in the room already knew. Abigail came every week. His voice softened. Every single week. He described the groceries, the repairs, the curtains she sewed, the meals she cooked, the nights she stayed while he was sick, the days she missed work to care for him, the countless acts of kindness nobody had asked her to perform. When he finished speaking, silence returned. This time it felt heavier.
Trevor finally exploded.
You manipulated us.
Walter nodded.
Yes. You turned our lives into an experiment. Yes. You watched us struggle. Yes. The honesty seemed to anger Trevor even more. Vanessa spoke next. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Why? Walter looked around the room, at his children, at the adults they had become, at the family Martha had spent her life protecting. Because after your mother died, I couldn't tell anymore. Nobody spoke. Walter continued. I couldn't tell if you loved me. The admission broke something open inside the room. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. Something sadder. Because for the first time, every person at that table understood what this had really been. Not a test of inheritance. Not a test of loyalty. A test created by a lonely old man who had lost the one person who always helped him understand his family. And the worst part was that some of the answers had hurt more than anyone expected, especially him. But the hardest truth of all had not yet been spoken. And before the day ended, Abigail would finally say it. The silence that followed Walter's confession seemed endless. No one moved. No one reached for the coffee growing cold on the table. Outside, the sound of Chloe and Ethan playing drifted through the open window. Life continued beyond the walls of the farmhouse. Inside, however, the Grayson family stood at a crossroads. Trevor was the first to break the silence. You had millions of dollars sitting in trust accounts. His voice was tight, controlled. And you watched Brandon lose everything. Walter didn't look away. Yes.
Trevor shook his head.
I don't even know what to say to that. Neither did Walter, because Trevor wasn't entirely wrong. The guilt had followed him every day since Brandon's visit to the trailer. Before anyone could respond, Brandon spoke. His voice was quiet, almost fragile. Stop. Everyone turned toward him. Brandon stared at the tabletop. His hands were trembling slightly. This isn't his fault. Trevor frowned. What? Brandon swallowed. I lost the business because of my decisions. The words came slowly, painfully. I borrowed too much money. I expanded too fast. I kept believing next month would fix everything. Nobody interrupted. For perhaps the first time in years, Brandon wasn't hiding behind excuses. When Dad said the money was gone, I wasn't angry. He laughed bitterly. I was terrified. Walter felt something tighten in his chest. Brandon continued. I wasn't worried about him. The admission hung heavily in the room. I was worried about me. No one spoke. The honesty was too raw, too real. Finally, Brandon looked up. His eyes were wet. I hate admitting that. Then Vanessa leaned back in her chair. For several seconds, she stared at the ceiling. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness Walter had rarely heard before. I don't think any of us are innocent. Trevor looked at her. Neither argued. Vanessa sighed. I told myself I'd visit. The words sounded almost like a confession. Every month I told myself I'd come next month. She laughed softly, without humor. Then next month became another month. Walter watched his daughter carefully. I always had a reason. A meeting. A project. A deadline. She looked down at her folded hands. The truth is, I stopped making family a priority. The room remained silent. Vanessa wiped at one eye. I kept assuming there would always be more time. No one challenged her, because everyone understood exactly what she meant. More time. That was the lie people told themselves until suddenly There wasn't any left. Then Abigail stood. For most of the meeting, she had remained quiet, listening, observing, waiting. Now every eye turned toward her. She looked first at Trevor, then Vanessa, then Brandon. Finally, she faced Walter. You're all talking like there are good guys and bad guys. Nobody answered, because they knew she was right. Abigail took a slow breath. We all failed. Trevor frowned. What do you mean? I mean all of us. She pointed gently toward her father. Dad failed, then toward her siblings. And so did we. The words landed with surprising force. Walter felt himself sit a little straighter. Abigail continued. Mom spent her whole life holding this family together. Everyone knew that was true. She had been the bridge, the translator, the person who remembered birthdays, made phone calls, and repaired hurt feelings before they became permanent damage. When Mom died, Abigail said quietly, none of us knew how to do what she did. Walter looked down. Because Martha had written the exact same thing in her journal. Abigail turned toward him. Dad, you spent your whole life providing for us. Walter nodded. I know, but providing isn't the same as connecting. The words hurt, mostly because they were true. You never came to most of Brandon's baseball games. Brandon stared at the table. You never called Vanessa in college unless there was a reason. Vanessa lowered her eyes. And Trevor spent half his life trying to earn your approval. The room grew completely still. Trevor looked away first. Walter suddenly understood why. Because it was true. For years, Trevor had built businesses, won awards, expand companies, and underneath all of it, perhaps he had simply wanted his father's pride, something Walter rarely expressed. Abigail's voice softened. Mom told me something before she died. Everyone listened. She said Dad loved all of us deeply. Walter closed his eyes. She said his problem wasn't love. A tear rolled down Vanessa's cheek. His problem was showing it. The farmhouse kitchen fell silent once more. But this silence felt different. Not angry. Not defensive. Honest. Walter slowly stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor. He looked at each of his children. Really looked at them. Not as adults. Not as problems to solve. Not as heirs. As his children. His family. I'm sorry. The words emerged quietly. Yet they seemed louder than anything else spoken that day. Trevor looked up. Vanessa stopped crying. Brandon stared at him. Walter swallowed hard. I'm sorry for the games I missed. He looked at Brandon. I'm sorry for the calls I never made. He looked at Vanessa. I'm sorry I never told you how proud I was. His eyes settled on Trevor. For a moment, neither father nor son spoke. Then Walter finished. I thought building a future for you was enough. His voice broke. It wasn't. Nobody moved. Then Abigail crossed the room. She sat beside her father and placed a hand on his arm. A simple gesture, the same gesture Martha would have made. One by one, the others followed. Not with speeches, not with dramatic forgiveness, just by staying, by sitting down, by choosing not to leave. And for the first time since Martha's death, the Grayson family stopped acting like strangers sharing DNA. They started acting like a family again. What happened next would determine whether that healing could last, because Walter still had one final decision to make. A decision that would shape the future of Grayson Ridge Farm long after he was gone. The morning after the family meeting, Walter stood on the porch of the farmhouse and watched the sunrise spread across Grayson Ridge Farm. Golden light rolled over the fields. The grain elevators stood tall against the horizon. Everything looked exactly as it had before the test began, yet nothing felt the same. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Walter wasn't alone. The farmhouse no longer felt like a museum filled with memories. It felt alive again. A week later, Nathaniel Brooks arrived carrying a briefcase full of documents. They sat together at the dining room table where generations of Graysons had shared meals. Nathaniel reviewed the final version of Walter's estate plan. The structure was simple. The 600 acres, grain elevators, and farm operations would be placed into a family trust. The trust would exist for future generations, not for one child, not for one branch of the family, for all of them. Nathaniel adjusted his glasses. And the trustee? Walter didn't hesitate. Abigail? Nathaniel nodded. Neither man needed an explanation. For 9 months, Abigail had proven something no financial statement could measure. She understood stewardship. She understood sacrifice. Most importantly, she understood people. The investment portfolio would be divided equally among Trevor, Vanessa, and Brandon. Walter had considered creating penalties, conditions, consequences. Gerald had talked him out of it. Don't spend your final years keeping score, his old friend had said. Walter had listened. One final page remained. A handwritten note, not legally binding, not enforceable, simply a request. Nathaniel read it and smiled. First Sunday dinner of every month. At the farmhouse. Come because you want to. The table is big enough. The attorney closed the file. I think Martha would like that. Walter smiled. So do I. The first dinner happened in July. Abigail organized everything. Of course she did. She arrived the day before with Lucas, Chloe, and Ethan. Together they filled the farmhouse with life. The smell of pot roast drifted through the kitchen. Vegetables simmered on the stove. Homemade rolls cooled on the counter. For the first time in years, the house sounded the way it used to, like family. Brandon arrived first. He looked nervous, standing in the doorway, as if he wasn't sure he belonged there anymore. Abigail immediately handed him a bag of potatoes. Start peeling. Brandon laughed. The tension eased. An hour later, Vanessa arrived carrying a pie she admitted came from a bakery. Her attempt at baking had apparently ended in disaster. For the first time in years, she sat in the kitchen without checking her phone every few minutes. She helped prepare dinner. She listened. She stayed. Trevor arrived last. His wife, Elise, came with him. So did their 2 college-age children. When Trevor stepped onto the porch, he paused. The farmhouse held memories. Good ones. Painful ones. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other. Then Walter extended his hand. Trevor took it. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. Some things are communicated more clearly through silence. Dinner was crowded. Chairs didn't match. The table wasn't large enough. Lucas had to bring in a folding table from the garage. Ethan spilled milk. Chloe laughed too loudly. Someone dropped a dinner roll. Nobody cared. The imperfections made the evening feel real. Walter sat at the head of the table. Not in his old seat. In Martha's, the position she had occupied for decades. The center of the family. The place where everyone could be seen. As conversation flowed around him, Walter watched quietly. Trevor discussed business ideas with Lucas. Vanessa helped Chloe with a school project. Brandon listened while Ethan explained the mechanics of toy tractors with absolute seriousness. Small moments. Ordinary moments. The kind Martha had always valued most. After dinner, the grandchildren ran outside to chase fireflies. Inside, dishes piled up in the sink. Trevor and Brandon washed them together. Not because anyone asked. Because it needed to be done. Vanessa wrapped leftovers. Abigail organized containers. The rhythm felt natural, comfortable, like a family relearning itself. Later that evening, after most of the dishes were finished, Walter found Brandon sitting alone on the porch. The younger man stared across the fields. I talked to Gerald, Brandon said. Walter sat beside him. Oh? He offered me work. Walter nodded. That's good. Brandon smiled faintly. I think I want to come back. To farming? To family. Walter looked at his son. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Walter placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but this time it wasn't translated through money, or advice, or problem solving. It was simply love. The guests gradually left. Cars disappeared down the gravel road one by one. Eventually, only Abigail's family remained. After Chloe and Ethan had gone upstairs to sleep, Walter walked into the living room. There, sitting on a shelf, was Martha's old recipe box. He picked it up carefully. The wood showed decades of use. Inside were recipe cards covered in faded handwriting. Notes, corrections, memories. Walter carried the box onto the porch where Abigail sat beneath the evening sky. This belongs to you. Abigail looked surprised. She opened the lid slowly. Her fingers moved across the familiar cards. Then she found an envelope hidden near the back. Her name appeared on the front, written in Martha's handwriting. Neither of them spoke. Abigail opened the letter. She read silently. As her eyes moved down the page, tears appeared. Not dramatic tears, quiet ones, the kind that come from love. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. Walter waited. Eventually he asked, "What did she say?" Abigail smiled through her tears. "Mom said she wasn't worried about me." Walter laughed softly. "That sounds like her." Abigail nodded. Then her expression softened. "She said she was worried about you." The two of them sat together beneath the stars. For a long time, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The farm would continue. The trust would protect future generations. The children were finding their way back to one another. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. Later that night, Walter stepped onto the porch alone. The fields stretched into darkness. The grain elevators stood silently against the horizon. The land he had spent a lifetime building surrounded him on every side. He touched the wedding ring hanging from a chain around his neck, a habit he had developed after Martha's death. "You would have hated the trailer," he said softly into the night. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "And you would have hated the notebook even more." The wind moved gently through the fields. Walter looked toward the farmhouse windows. Warm light glowed from inside. He could hear Abigail laughing, Lucas saying something that made the children giggle. Life, family, home, the things Martha had spent 48 years protecting. At that moment, Walter finally understood the lesson she had been trying to teach him all along. The land was valuable. The elevators were valuable. The money was valuable, but none of them were the true inheritance. The real inheritance was sitting inside that farmhouse, waiting for him, loving him, belonging to him. A voice suddenly called from inside. "Grandpa, are you coming?" "Ethan," Walter smiled. "I'm coming." He took one final look at the fields. Then he turned away from the darkness and walked toward the light, toward the warmth, toward the family waiting inside. And for the first time since Martha's death, Walter Grayson felt completely home.